My pleasure and my honor, David. I'm delighted to be with you today and to get to know all of you on the panel. We have a superb panel, uh, and they're bringing many insights to us today about disability and the litigation of disability, the understanding of disability, the solving of problems about disability rights. And I look forward to hearing all of you today. Each panelist is going to speak for no more than 5 minutes, and they're going to speak on an important insight that they would like to share with our audience. I'm going to lead it off, and then we'll go alphabetically, beginning with Professor Degner. But let me begin and share my little story. My own journey with disability began in earnest about 35 years ago when I was diagnosed to have a very rare, very slowly progressive muscle disease called inclusion body myositis, or IBM. And to this day, they don't know what causes it, and there is no known cure for it. And so over the past 35, 36 years now, I've gone from a fully active life of tennis, volleyball on the weekends, hiking, jogging, and such things, to slowly to having to use a cane, then slowly having to use a walker, then a wheelchair part-time, and now a full-time use of a wheelchair or a little electric scooter if I want to get out on my own and see the town. Now, this very brief background is to explain my perspective about disability and about my disability and about disability in general, because I believe that someone who becomes disabled in the way I've just described over a prolonged period of time and at a mature age might have a considerably different perspective than someone who, for example, was born with a disability, or who at a mature age suddenly becomes disabled, for example, in an accident. And since my disability has come on slowly, as I've said, I've learned two important insights about entering the world of disability. People can be wonderful, kind, and generous. When my wife, Maria, is wheeling me around in a wheelchair, I couldn't have imagined that so many people, if they see us coming to a building, rush ahead and open the door, or help us on an elevator, or even offers my wife to push if we're coming up a hill. So people are wonderful when they're aware of you, and they see you and see that you might need help. They can also be stunningly unaware and insensitive, although still well-meaning. And I'll just give one example of that, and I'm sure we've all had, we who are disabled have all had this experience. When I first fully retired to the wheelchair, I would still be invited out. And I was sort of stunned at invitations to go to places and not being experienced. And I would say, sure, I'll be there next Sunday night. And then I would get there and realize, wow, there are 8 steps I can't get in. Or inviting me to a public place in which there was no access. And so I had to learn over a period of time that I need to check. I need to check on this. I can't count on the people who are inviting me to understand it or check on it or even to have thought about it. And so I do that now, and there's no problem, although on occasion I will still ask the question, is it accessible? And be told, oh yes, it is, and find out it really isn't in terms of how I'm going to get into a building. But I want to tell you that I'm guilty of that same kind of insensitivity. I have been in the past. When the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake destroyed large portions of San Francisco and much of the federal courthouse where I worked, it became my duty as a chief judge to oversee reconstruction of that courthouse. And when the architect asked the committee I formed if we wanted to make one of the rebuilt courtrooms accessible, our utterly insensitive and our utterly simplistic response to the architect was to say that we've never had a disabled judge of this court since the court was founded in 1850. So why would we need one? And we said, no disabled court. Now, I should be hugely embarrassed to tell this story, and I am, but this is the perfect forum to share this, to spread this important message about the disability world that's out there and understand what their needs are and understand that they are there, we're not going away, and we need to make room in the world so that they can live comfortably also. And what greater irony could there be than that I became the first disabled judge in the 440-year history of the court. And it was my job to then go hat in hand to Washington, D.C., to the administrative office to ask for funds so that I could have a courtroom when I finally became fully disabled. Fortunately, my condition was progressing slowly enough that the court was ready by the time that I really needed it. And I tell this story to say that we have, all of us, so much to learn, and there is so much to be taught. And this is the perfect panel to start teaching these important things to all of us and head us toward understanding this in our law schools and teaching it knowledgeably in our law schools in ways that are going to help disabled. So next, we're going to hear from Theresia Degener, who is in Germany. Theresia?
Thank you very much. I was asked by David to introduce myself. I'm a professor of law and disability studies at the Protestant University of Applied Sciences in Bochum, Germany. And I would like to spend some of my 5 minutes on shortly reflecting on how was it for me when I came to Berkeley as a law student in some more than 30 years ago in 1987. When I came, I thought law is boring and all it has to offer to disabled people is social welfare law. And during that time in Germany, we had a big discussion on whether or not we should, from the disability movement, demand an anti-discrimination law, yes or no. And some of us said, no, we need to first do awareness raising before we can introduce the law. And the others said, no, first the law and then society changes. Well, when I came to Berkeley, I wanted to study all that in the law books. What I learned is that the law had already helped to change society because I could tell as a disabled person born without arms, I'm so used to be stared at all the time, me and my family. And when I came to Berkeley, nothing of that happened. People didn't stare at me. I was allowed to be in restaurants and eat with my feet on the table. No one could throw me out. That was such a new experience. So I quickly changed my mind on that subject and that, we need an anti-discrimination law right away. So I also learned that when I came to Berkeley as a law student, that was the first time I ever was asked if I need something in order to have equal opportunities to study. All my law studies in Frankfurt, no one asked me, and I had to just see how I get by. So it was a real wake up in terms of what law reform can do to society. I could see it, I could experience it. And when I studied law that 1 year for the Masters of Laws at Berkeley, I studied constitutional civil rights law and sex-based discrimination law, which 30 years ago was not a subject taught at all in German law schools at that time. And for me, reading Brown versus Board of Education and Califano versus Goldfarb, I think for the first time I felt that law can be a social justice tool. As an intern with DRADF, with the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund in Berkeley or Oakland, I even learned more about how to do that and how to do strategic litigation in order to achieve justice in the real life of people. And I think that basis gave me also the strength to work towards anti-discrimination law in my own country, but also at the international level when we did the background work for the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Now, I would like to finally just mention shortly the pandemic discussion we are having now, and I think we will come back to that in the discussion. But right now, I'm learning even more how important law can be as a tool in shaping society, because in Germany, like in many other countries, we are now discussing what will happen if the resources are not enough. Who will have medical treatment and who not? And so some of the medical associations made guidelines, and the National Ethics Committee also said, yeah, those guidelines are okay. In fact, they are not. They are violating human rights law. They are discriminatory against disabled people, because they apply the so-called clinical frailty scale. We come back to that maybe later. But they are totally discriminatory against disabled people and people who need assistance, or people who assistance services will be left out from treatment if there is a scarcity of resources. So going back to the rule of law and looking at human rights law is really important right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresia. Judy?
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate on this panel. And I think I'm the only non-lawyer on the panel. But I have to say that lawyers have been integral to my life and to the advocacy work that I've done. I'm 72, so for many, many years now. And also to say that my husband, Jorge, is a wheelchair rider, and we were married in Berkeley, California by a disabled judge. Her name is Gail, and I'm sorry to say I don't remember her last name at the moment, but I first started working with attorneys when I had to sue the Board of Education of the city of New York when I was denied a teaching license. And I was denied my teaching license in writing because I was unable to walk. And this was before Section 504 or the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. My experience at that time was when I called the American Civil Liberties Union, this was 1970, and told them that I had been denied the job and the reason why, and said that I wanted to come in and talk with them to see if they would represent me. They refused to meet with me. They said that what happened was not discrimination, it was a medical decision. So we are in 2020 now, and I think we can see that we've made some very important headway in the United States and countries around the world because of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But I think it's important to recognize that not that long ago, and probably still in many places, people do not see some forms of discrimination that people with various kinds of disabilities experience as discrimination. I grew up in Brooklyn. I went to Berkeley, California. I was there for about 18 years. I was on the staff of the Berkeley Center for Independent Living. And we started working very early with legal aid and other law firms when there were cases that we were trying to bring. For example, when a county in California was trying to order buses that weren't accessible. What we found was very important is always the need to be able to train lawyers on disability-related issues, because there really were very few lawyers with disabilities who understood the law as well as understanding from a disability perspective, just as the judge was talking about earlier, some of the issues that we face. So we were quite successful in Berkeley getting engagement from legal aid and others, but decided that we needed to set up a paralegal program at first to be able to get disabled people trained, but also to be able to work more proactively with law firms. The paralegal program in CIL Berkeley spun off and became its own organization, the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, which, as we know, is now really the preeminent disability-run law organization representing the rights of disabled people. One of the critical issues that's going on right now, as Theresa was mentioning, is the pandemic and COVID-19. And it's very important to be able to see the work that DREDF is doing, the leadership role that it's playing in being able to address legal issues like Theresa was discussing, and the coalition of organizations that are now there, enabling us to much more rapidly, both at the California level and around the United States, to proactively and in a more powerful cross-disability civil human rights approach to be able to address discrimination at this period of time. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Our next speaker is Elizabeth Jameson, and Elizabeth and I go back many years with the beginnings of our disability. We both have what I would call progressive disability that's taken a long time to get from where we were when we first met all those years ago at Mike and Christine's house to where we are today. Elizabeth, would you tell your 5 minutes, please?
I'd be happy to. I wanted to convene this conference because I wanted to possibly change how law school approaches disability law. When I went to law school, I always wanted to do civil rights law. And when I graduated, I had no understanding about, even though I studied disability law, did not understand the complexity of the issues involving disability law, because I had no knowledge or experience or dialogue with people who had disabilities. And I want to share a very embarrassing story that has really haunted me all through the years, since now I'm very disabled. When I was second year in law school, there was a student who was enrolled at Berkeley Law School, was a quadriplegic. She lived 3 doors down from me. And I never once sat down and talked with her about what is it like for her to navigate the halls of law school in a wheelchair. And I never once acknowledged the fact that her experience was, of course, different than my experience as a young, ambitious, healthy woman. And why was that? It was I was afraid of her. I was afraid of looking at her body. I was afraid of approaching her, afraid of making a mistake. And basically, I ignored her. And now I understand someone who lives a life navigating a wheelchair, that people can be uncomfortable around me, because we're all trying to deal with the fact that disability is a part of being human And it's a major issue of looking at our own frailty, because each and every one of us is going to be disabled at some point in our lives. And I think that law schools might consider ways of having disabled people come and talk about their life with disability. So they have exposure to disabilities like I didn't have. And I'm embarrassed to say, because Judy was a contemporary of mine, but I really didn't know her. Never had coffee with her, no less the law student. So my desire is to work with the law school and professors to see how we can engage more with students. And when I graduated from law school, I became an advocate for children who were locked up in jails and prisons. And because I didn't have human connection with disability, I was not as good a lawyer as I could have been. Now, in retrospect, there's so many issues I missed in my advocacy for kids. And I think we learn a lot from being around people with disabilities. And I'm also very concerned about, as we all are, every day when we open up the newspaper, about the worldwide epidemic and the fact that we're having discussions about rationing, potential rationing, or actual rationing, is people with disabilities are often ignored or seen as less equal than other people who don't have disabilities or people who are younger in age. And I think our discussions, our reactions, and have to be could be, they don't have to be, but I think that the civil rights law and the United Nations policy on disability can be a jumping point for looking at how we deal with this whole access to health care. Because I myself am terrified. I'm a person who has pulmonary problems. And when I hear about limiting access to ventilators, my heart rate goes high. So I really think the disability law is a jumping point for human rights and justice issues. So I'll leave it to Judge Henderson for the next talk.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Next, we're going to hear from Sydney Pickern, who is with DREDF, a DREDF staff attorney. And for those who don't know about DREDF, Disability Rights and Education and Defense Fund, they've won some of the most important cases on disability rights in our country, because they're now nationwide. They're also situated in New York, but some of those cases were in my own court, and I can attest to the fine work that they do. And some of the cases I'm most proud of were litigated by DREDF. Sydney?
Thanks for that introduction. And I just wanted to say thank you for the opportunity and for the privilege of speaking with this group of exemplary people today. I want to say also, you know, what a trying and scary and also hopeful time that we find ourselves in. And I want to acknowledge the work being done, particularly at the local level, by the disability community and care workers and allies and mutual aid systems that are not based strictly on compensation, but caring and love. And I know that this fight will be won in these spaces. And if there's anyone listening to this while the pandemic is ongoing and you're in a position to reach out to a person you know who is in need, a loved one, a person with a disability, an elder, to offer assistance in any safe way that you can, you'll be contributing in an extraordinary way to our collective survival and evolution. And on a related front of what it means to share and fight for a common struggle, I'd like to briefly highlight today an integral part of what we've learned from disability rights history in terms of what can be accomplished when human rights interests coalesce and how important collaboration and advocacy continues to be. As we know, a key piece in the advancement of disability rights was the utilization of the anti-segregation protest methods of the civil rights movement, which greatly contributed to the passage of the Rehabilitation Act, marking the first time that the exclusion and segregation of people with disabilities was viewed as discrimination. The advancement of disability rights was also deeply intertwined with the advancement of other civil rights, particularly in challenging Supreme Court decisions that set misguided and harmful precedents in the 1980s and passing national legislation to make right some of the gains that the High Court had set back during that time. So this history really reflects how vital it is to continue to foster environments that in our advocacy spaces that reflect these past efforts. And I think a big part of this means striving to make sure that the advocacy that we elevate centers diverse communities, including people of color with disabilities, queer people with disabilities, and cross disabilities, including those with mental health disabilities and other communities that have been historically marginalized. And of course, in the work that we do as attorneys, whether it's more formal litigation or policy work, it's a fundamental requirement that the people we represent have a voice. And I think it's especially important for people with multiple marginalized identities who experience disability discrimination, because we, even in the process of accessing an advocate, whether it's making sure that our communities know that we are here as a resource available to them, that our spaces reflect the diversity of our communities, and that we have multiple methods of communicating with people in the languages they use. These are all some of the barriers that we must continue to break down so that we can grow our advocacy collectively. And another important piece of this is that when we talk about legal remedies and representing the interests of people with disabilities, it's here again that we have the opportunity to endeavor to make sure that we do everything we can to incorporate the voices of people with disabilities in long-term solutions, which means not only understanding the systemic discrimination that led to the harm, but also being able to go beyond just making a person whole or righting the wrong, but institutionalizing change. And I think this is something that we all know that can be particularly challenging. In the work that we do, we often are fighting systems that are either designed to actively keep our people out or in, if we're thinking about institutional settings. And as we know, systems are hard to change. And so often the most clear-cut remedy is that we require an entity to do something more, we create or change a policy, or we ask an entity to refrain from doing something altogether. But I think where we have to keep pushing in terms of the law and for our diverse clients And I think this is often part of the art of the negotiation process, is convincing the other side to implement policies and protections that root out archaic and ableist culture, which is often at the root of many discriminatory practices. And that is why the disability rights movement was necessary in the first place. And one of the concepts that I often encounter in the work I do with people who are affected by discriminatory housing and emergency response practices is, how do we design systems where people with diverse disabilities hold positions with oversight power? And I think this is definitely where non-lawyering advocacy comes into play. So we have to show up in our communities on the issues that are important to people with disabilities with multiple marginalized identities, so that when we have the privilege to be at the table, we can effectively represent our clients' voices. Again, I want to say thank you to the panel for including me today, and for the life-changing work that you've all done.
Thank you, Sydney. And our final panelist is Professor Gerard Quinn. And are you in Sweden or Ireland today, Professor Quinn?
I'm in Ireland. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hi. I'm really glad you're seeing me today, because my daughter cut my hair yesterday. and
Looks
much
good.
more presentable. So this is a really interesting group. And I'm a bit of an outlier in that I don't have a disability myself, although our eldest daughter has a disability, and I'll come to that momentarily. I didn't start out as a lawyer. My background is in political philosophy, political science, and I tend to take the view that law is just applied political philosophy. And even when it isn't, you need the tools of political science to know how to use the law to its optimum. And I kind of got involved through a series of accidents. One was that, and I don't think I ever told Teresa this, I took some time out from studying at the Inns of Court to be a barrister in Ireland, to attend to be what's called a stagiaire, an intern basically, in the Council of Europe's legal directorate in Strasbourg. Very, very interested in criminal procedure, but I had a head of unit who was from Germany, sorry Teresa, and he said, "I'll show you nothing." So quite by accident, I ended up in the office next door working on a recommendation to European governments on mental health law. Now, I was still pretty backward, but it was my first kind of expose into the field, and it was still very medically orientated, but nevertheless, it whet my appetite. I spent some time working with Mary Robinson and Kevin Boyle on some terrorism cases, going from Ireland to the Council of Europe's Court of Human Rights. And what that really got me interested in was theories of difference, the role of human rights to bring communities together, not just to vindicate people when wrong had been done, but to build bridges between different communities. And why was it that the difference between being Protestant and being Catholic had made such a difference in Northern Ireland? So I ended up going to the States for postgraduate work, just like Teresia, except I went to the East Coast, not the West Coast. Stayed at Harvard for 3 years to do my master's and my doctorate, and got lost really in legal history, legal theory, did some amazing coursework on US civil rights, particularly the Reconstruction period, which has always stayed with me as an interest, and international human rights law. Returned then to Ireland to start an academic career in the late 80s, and probably would have spent 30, 40 years in jurisprudence or legal history, totally innocent stuff. But our first daughter was born at the end of 1989 with a disability. And I remember watching TV when George Bush #1 signed into law the ADA. And that it didn't just shine a light, it really just threw everything into sharp relief. And everybody around the world in different countries will say exactly the same thing. They're not thinking about the wording of the legislation, they're thinking about the symbolic message that the legislation sent, which is that you can frame these issues not as medical issues, but as issues of justice and human rights. So I remember thinking to myself, we can do that here too. And by here I meant Europe, not just in Ireland. And really my career since then has been one of kind of nomadism, like drifting between the university and governments or international organizations to get things done. And got involved at Tracia and a few others, actually at European level first. If you remember Tracia, we were part of the report on invisible citizens in the early 90s that basically got the Europeans to adopt the equivalent of the 14th Amendment, the equivalent of Section 5 of the 14th Amendment at European Union level, which then allowed legislation to be adopted and so forth. So I should explain, we have 3 daughters and they're all doing extremely well. And Niamh is now 31, which is amazing. I keep pinching myself. And in ancient Celtic, Niamh means radiance and sunshine, and she really has been. So I've spent a lot of my career in academia, but outside of academia. And Tracy and I wrote the paper in 2000 for DREDF, for your amazing conference in DC. I always remember the dance at that conference, but we can talk about that later. Tracy and I got involved in putting the arguments together to draft a treaty, UN Treaty on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And lo and behold, we both ended up on various delegations throughout the process. And then 15 years ago, I inaugurated a Centre on International Disability Law and Policy at the National University of Ireland. I was there for over 30 years. I left it 2 years ago because I figured 30 years is long enough at any one thing. And I now have 2 part-time research chairs, one in Sweden and one in the UK. But what we did with that research centre was we said our ethos has changed. We're not interested in the statics of legal knowledge. We're interested in the dynamics of change. We started a master's and a PhD programs, lots of lessons to tell you about how that went. And we also inaugurated an international summer school, which 2 years ago when I left had over 200 participants. Judy keynoted at one of them. From over 50 countries, and it's very well financially subsidized by philanthropies and some governments and so forth. And that has had a huge effect in terms of rippling out motivation to people to become involved in what I call disability policy entrepreneurship, actually doing things with the law and policy and creating law and policy where none has existed. At our very first summer school, we had a Russian participant from St. Petersburg. And the first thing he did when he got back to St. Petersburg is he sued the local city council for inaccessibility. And I'll tell you how that went as well. So lots to contribute to the discussion on legal education, but let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think, much to my surprise, we're on schedule so far. I've done those kinds of panels many years on the court legal panels, and they rarely end on time when you tell people to speak no more than 5 minutes. Someone goes way over. So congratulations on that. Now I want to go to the panel as a whole, and I'm going to start it with this observation. When I was a senior in law school, and you could take electives and you were looking for interesting electives, and my buddies in law school were looking for public interest kinds of things, because That's what we wanted to do when we got out of law school. There was a course called ecology, and it's the first time I ever heard of ecology. And we sort of avoided it. We didn't know what it meant. Something now, environmental law. We all know environmental law, and it's a very important and a very welcome course at most of our major law schools. So how can we, and I'll open it up to the panel, how can we ensure that law schools will include disability law as a part of their mission to address civil rights? And hopefully it will grow to the point where it's as well known and well understood as ecology and environmental law is today over the years. And how do we get it off to a faster start than ecology got started? Because I think people will know what disability rights means, rather where they didn't know what ecology meant back in 1962. Who wants to start with this?
One of the most important insights I had during the last decade, since we are trying to implement the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and I've been teaching law at many different places around the world. I think what we need to understand is that teaching law without including disability law is outdated law teaching. And it means that, I mean, how can you teach equality law these days without understanding the concept of reasonable accommodation? How can you teach contract law without critical reflection on legal capacity as a tool to discriminate, especially against people with cognitive disabilities or psychosocial disabilities? And how can you teach IT law without knowing anything about accessibility of information technology? So I think understanding that teaching law without addressing disability is teaching outdated law, is teaching bad law. It's teaching less qualitative law. It's bad teaching. That's what I think. I think what we also need to think about is how do we interest people, young law students, into the disability issue. And what I did when I was working on the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disability, which I was a member for 8 years. And in these 8 years, I brought 100 law students to the United Nations because I took them on as assistants, or I did legal clinics at various law schools, and I took them along and made them work on cases. And most of these, some of them, these students enrolled, and they were already motivated because they were interested in disability. But I think the majority only took on the job because they really wanted to get into the United Nations. It's really difficult to get there, and they just took any possibility to get there. But all of them, I think, all of them really got excited about the disability issue when they started learning about the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, and we compared it with the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and we looked at other legal issues, and they said, wow, looking at disability make us understand so much better the concepts of law and how we construct society and change with using law, and how we also discriminate or exclude people by having concepts like legal capacity, or incapacity concepts, which exclude certain persons from interacting with us legally. So I think we really need to understand that disability might be a starting point for many young people also to understand why it makes sense to study law. And it's not only about earning money, but it's about really making a change and being an agent in making a change, being an agent of change in this arena. Thank you.
So, Teresa, I'd like to ask you a question. I think nobody on this panel would disagree with anything you're saying. So I'm interested in your view and others of how much success you've had in getting law schools in Germany and around the world to really embrace the inclusion of disability in legal training.
We had very few success. I mean, it is still in most law schools, it's not being taught. And if
I think
only
that's
if
really, I think this is a really pivotal question, because you argue very accurately and powerfully about why it's important. So I think we're also needing to look at why, with people like you and Gerard and others arguing this way, we're still not making the progress that we need to. I'm wondering, when people have to take their bar exams, whatever the equivalents are in their country, are there any questions in the area of disability? Is there any reason why people may need to learn more about disability outside of the fact that we can understand why it's appropriate and just for all the reasons you've said? What is out there that could motivate law schools to do some teaching in this area, even if they're not motivated to do it now?
David?
Well, I see Elizabeth was about to add something, so I'll withdraw for now.
Elizabeth, were you going to?
Yeah, I just want to say I would love law schools to make exposure to people with disabilities more possible. That there are now narrative books like About Us, book that honored people with disabilities, wrote their narratives, and to make disability more accessible by people can see the lives of people with disabilities. The only way people will get comfortable with disability law is by reading and seeing and talking to people with disabilities. So I would like students to have exposure to people with disability.
David?
Thank you, Judge. To agree with and expand on a few things that have been said, Elizabeth's point, I think, is a really important one in terms of law school admissions. Because it's great to bring panels into the school, and of course this would have been at school instead of on Zoom, but for the pandemic, where students get to interact with lawyers and judges and others who are themselves people with disabilities. And although that's certainly not why we invited Judge Henderson to become a distinguished visitor at Berkeley, I think it's great in terms of that question of exposure. It's also really important that we usually have at least one wheelchair rider in our student body at any time, often more than one. And it requires for many of our students developing that human relationship that Elizabeth was talking about earlier. On the question of how to put more disability rights law into the curriculum, and to go back to Teresa's question or comment, and this also goes to a long-standing discussion in legal pedagogy about how we teach legal ethics. Do we teach legal ethics by having a course in legal ethics or by incorporating legal ethics across the curriculum? And the answer, I think, in legal ethics has been both, and I think it's the same answer, and this is the point that Teresa was making, in terms of disability rights. That at Berkeley, we have a course in disability rights law that's taught by Arlene Meyerson, who's was until recently the, I guess, general counsel or chief counsel of DREDF for many, many years. But what's equally important is the way in which law school hypotheticals in classrooms and courses in which there is a reason to teach about accommodation or to teach about the ADA for statutory interpretation become part of a course, not because it's a course in disability rights law, but because disability rights law belongs in many parts of the curriculum. And helping faculty, because most of these decisions are made by individual faculty, to appreciate the importance of that, I think, is an important part of the challenge that each of the panelists has been issuing.
This is Sydney, and I'd love to jump into this just really quickly. And I think when we're, thank you, when we're talking about institutionalizing disability rights law in law school, we also have to, again, think about the barriers people with disabilities experience even getting into law school. So what skills that we value and rank in the law school admission process, and what societal barriers obstruct people with disabilities from even contemplating a legal career, including the cost. And then, of course, once in law school, what it means to place value on our diverse and disabled students, including providing information on and removing stigma around reasonable accommodations, for example, providing mental health resources, preparing students with mental health disabilities for the often invasive and unnecessary mental health portion of many states' moral character exams, and having a real conversation with students at the beginning of their journeys on the realities of being an attorney with a disability. What type of advocacy might suit their needs, whether class action litigation or policy work would be a better target, information on how to request reasonable accommodations in the workplace, tools for negotiating compensation considering the cost of healthcare and housing needs, and then working effectively with co-counsel. And I also think, to Judy's question, law schools would benefit obviously from having more people with disabilities as part of their teaching and counseling programs, to emphasize all of these points, and also having that kind of representation. It could come too from academia, from professors with disabilities, emphasizing the need to have these disability rights law courses.
Let me ask you, Sydney, does your office, as an example, do you take interns from the law school at any time, or have you been doing that, or have you considered that? Because it's my feeling that very often students can get in and see what you do day to day and see the good they can do, and that might set them off as an entree. Are there any such programs at your place or nationwide that are there to introduce students to how wonderful this can be and how satisfying work it can be?
Yeah, Judge, in the answer to your question, I mean, DREDF has multiple opportunities around the year. So in all quarters, including summer, for internship opportunities for students locally and nationally. And I think, something that DREDF always tries to do is make sure that students are accommodated, that their needs are accommodated, that students with disabilities feel like they will prosper in our workplace. But I think, often something that continues to be a challenge is encouraging students with disabilities to apply to internship programs. And I think, that's something that continues to be a struggle just across the board.
I also think I'm on the board of DREDF, so yes, they do have interns, but like all programs, if they had more money, they'd have more interns.
Yeah.
And I think the other issue also is, it is very important for law students to get experiences working in places like Dredif, but I think we've also been discussing the importance of disabled lawyers getting experiences in law firms that are doing other than disability law so that they can be bringing their knowledge and experience about disability into other law firms. So I think looking at how internships are developed and whether other law firms are also including disabled law students when they do the recruitment, then how groups like DREDF could also be a part of the training that law students get in their internships on disability law would also be valuable.
Mm-hmm. Professor Quinn, did you want
Yes.
to speak?
Yeah, I think things have changed quite a bit. I put a book together in 1993 on comparative disability discrimination law in the US, Canada, and Australia, and got appointed to a government commission here in Ireland because of that, and then proposed to the Dean that I would put on a course on comparative disability discrimination law. If I weren't on that government commission, there's no way in the wide world he would have allowed that course to go ahead. And indeed, the people who were teaching the equality law course viewed me as a threat and saw this as potentially undermining positive accomplishments in their field, which was gender and so forth. That's changed a lot, but that's where we're coming from. That was the base. And I generated a lot of money to start the master's and the PhD programs. And faculty politics being faculty politics, one other unit wanted to grab that money and then put me to put on the courses, but have actually no support whatsoever. I won that battle, but it left a lot of scars. There is a network of law schools around the world funded by the Open Society Foundation. And I think we're kind of missing a few tricks because they've never developed like a model curriculum that can be tailored region to region. And I think that's certainly something they could do. They've never generated an international moot court competition that would really stimulate interest in Africa, the Americas, Asia Pacific. And it doesn't cost a lot of money, but it really gets the best novice legal minds invested in the disability issues. There's things that can be done that I think maybe some foundations could be approached to see if they could fund that. Anyhow, sorry, my tuppence halfpenny worth.
Thank you.
I guess sorry.
Yes.
I have a comment. I'm wondering, for those of you who have been successful on getting courses focusing on disability law or getting disability issues relating to other equality courses, has there ever been any surveying done of the students and the value they find in that, and any comments from faculty as to whether or not they see this as something which is valuable? Do we have any formal or informal data on that?
I think, David, you would know better than I. Certainly after the classes I've taught at the law school, the students are asked how helpful, how meaningful the class was, how it could be improved. And that's information is certainly relayed to the professor or professors. I co-taught a course, so I know it's available. The student feedback from those who take the course, but is it available beyond that, David? Do you know?
I think at most law schools, the information, the evaluations that students do are made available to other students so that they can decide which courses to take.
Yeah.
And I do think at all law schools that I know of, they do collect student evaluations of courses. But the next step in that, which I think Judy is suggesting, is that someone should gather all of that data, possibly anonymized, in order to ask at a larger level, at a broader level, how important is this within the experience of students as a way of advocating for more teaching in the field? I think the first step would be to figure out, is this a course that's taught at most law schools? I suspect it's fairly common, but I don't have a basis in data for that belief.
I don't either, but I suspect that one of the things that might be daunting, certainly, is the materials, that having to create your own materials for a course can be daunting to someone who would rather use a case book that's already there. And I'm imagining, and I don't know this to be the fact, that there are no case books on disability law at this point. Does anyone know whether that's so?
Actually, there's one or two just produced. So that kind of excuse is no longer really there, to be honest. One of the other things, one of the lessons we learned is our programs weren't sufficiently flexible to allow others in different programs to cross-register, because lots of different students and lots of disciplines have an interest in disability law, and we fixed that midway through, but it was a problem right at the beginning.
I also think it's, in some way, the students themselves need to be more proactive on this. I think that when you look at other minority groups on college campuses, they're much more proactive in demanding that, you know, women's studies, Black studies, etc., are a part of curricula across the campuses. And we still don't see the same degree of protests and proactive activities, not just from disabled students, but from others, which I think speaks to a problem still that exists on many college campuses, which is for students who have invisible disabilities, they're frequently really afraid of speaking up about that. And so I think, sure, this is true in the law schools too, that, you know, you don't want to be disclosing anything that you feel could potentially adversely affect your progress in moving into a profession. So I think, you know, I think Berkeley is doing a pretty decent job. It's got a lot further to go on integrating disability across work going on at the university with the chair and things of that nature. But I think the degree of needing more proactive vocal discussions, not just about law, but across the board, and why is there such an absence at the university levels of really talking about civil and human rights and equity in disability, still needs to be ramped up.
Thank you, Judith. I noticed that Christine Brigagliana has joined us, and Christine, you were instrumental in bringing about this panel. Do you have any thoughts on this or anything you want to say to us? I don't want to put you on the spot here. Well, what did you have in mind when you thought about this? What would you like to see come out of this?
When I really didn't do anything except introduce Elizabeth Jameson, who had the idea and is an old dear friend of mine, and Felton, who is another dear friend of mine, who I knew would be interested, and David Oppenheimer, who I knew would be interested and teaches at the law school. And I thought, gee, David's course and clinic is perfect for this subject. And that was really all I did. But in listening to the panelists, one of the things that struck me is that I like Gerald's idea of the moot court. And if we could think of more different ways to introduce disability rights issues to general coursework through con law, through legal writing. You know, legal writing professors could easily give an assignment that involved writing about a disability access issue. Moot court instructors could easily, I was remembering back to 1980 one when I was in law school, and my moot court assignment was involved abortion rights. And I knew very little about it. And it was fascinating to me and got me excited about thinking about that issue. And I think this is a way to get to more students in a broader way. I think disability rights law courses individually are of course important, but in thinking about a broader way to get more people thinking about the issues, if these ideas could be introduced at meetings of deans and clinical professors and things, that might be a wonderful entree to the subject for people who have not really thought about it much. And the other thing that was raised that I had never thought about were the difficulties and challenges of applicants to law schools, even getting through the door to be law students who have disabilities. And I don't know, I think that admissions offices would have to reach out the way they have developed ways of reaching out to minority students on college campuses. They would have to reach out specifically to people with disabilities to get more applicants into law schools. And as Elizabeth pointed out, we've all had this experience. Once you know someone who's gay or someone who's disabled or who is, a minority, you begin to see them and the group they associate with in a different light. Well, that's all I want to say, but thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'd like to add to that and just say, there are courses that are being taught on university campuses in areas like prison reform. And when you look at prisons in the United States and other countries where in the juvenile facilities, 60 to 70% of youth who are in those facilities have disabilities, but the issues are not typically really being discussed. If we really were looking at what needed to be done, both in the area of prevention and interventions, understanding laws like the US law in education, as an example, and how this law is frequently not being appropriately applied to youth who wind up in prisons, there would be ways of integrating disability into subjects that are already being taught, where disability should be a part of it, but hasn't been.
Very pertinent. That's correct. Yes. Any closing words that you want to say to David?
I'd like to say thank you to everyone.
And I've joined that. Thank you very much. This has been wonderful, and I've learned a lot just sitting here listening, and I never thought I knew everything that needed to be known, but I learned a lot of things that I didn't know I didn't know. Thank you all.